You and I should work together.
You mean we would sell the bodies to the doctors together to dig them up?
There'll be no digging. The kirkyards are too well guarded. We will, so to speak, burk them.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me as always is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
Alright, so if everything goes according to plan, before this episode goes up this Saturday, you'll have been able to hear the third and final part in the supplemental series of bonus episodes that I made about Val Lewton, his background, his career at RKO, and I ended those supplemental series at precisely this pivot point, because at this point, Val Lewton is now coming off of a string of box office disappointments after a really strong showing with his first three films. So his first three films, Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, do fairly well. The Leopard Man isn't lighting up the box office or anything, but it does pretty well. After that, The Seventh Victim underperforms. The Ghost Ship is only out for about a month before it's withdrawn from circulation because of a lawsuit. Curse of the Cat People isn't necessarily a huge box office draw either. Mademoiselle Fifi is one of the lowest performing films of his career. And then, of course, on the last official episode, the last official episode as far as the patrons are concerned, with Youth Runs Wild, basically he had probably the most stellar, the most spectacular failure of his career. Not just in terms of the fact that it was a box office bomb, but just the sheer trial that it was to make the movie. The fact that he tried to make the film the way that he wanted to make it, and at this point, it had preview showings that were so bad, and the film itself was proving so controversial that eventually RKO more or less took the film away from him, told him this is what we need the film to be like, released a bastardized version of it later in the year, which bombed at the box office. There's this sort of point we've reached where there is this sort of a kind of morale killer as far as Val Lewton's career. But at the very same time, what's quite interesting is that as and as I hope I alluded to successfully in our supplemental episodes, and the cliffhanger I left you on with that one, something very interesting is about to happen here, which is that despite the fact that Val Lewton is going to be having, in a certain sense, less official creative control over the films he makes, he's now going to be, part of what's coming down from the RKO executives is that, okay, no more fooling around. You are going to exclusively be making horror movies for now. You are going to submit daily rushes. We're not just going to be monitoring the development process of the film. We're going to be monitoring the production through every step of the way. And in addition to that, to replace Sid Rochelle, who you had a very a toxic professional relationship with, who you didn't work well with as your supervisor, as your direct supervisor in RKO. We are replacing Sid Rochelle with a guy named Jack J. Gross. Now, Jack J. Gross is a veteran of Universal. He was the executive producer on several of, most notably The Wolfman, Phantom of the Opera, and The Son of Dracula. So he's being brought in, and Lewton with the understanding that they are basically bringing in a person whose instincts as far as the horror genre are the exact opposite of Lewton's. Lewton wants to make films that are very grounded and contemporary feeling. Jack J. Gross is coming out of Universal, which has its completely different kind of house style and stylistic tradition, which is that no, horror films are basically once upon a time stories. What people like is forward-facing marquee monsters and horror stars, not ponderous stories about monstrosity or the nature of reality or whatever Lewton has been, experimenting with while he's been at RKO. And so they bring this guy into the fold. But the interesting thing is that now that Jack Gross is part of, is he Lewton's immediate supervisor, there's also this weird way in which he's not only intent on reining in Lewton's eccentricities, he's also intent on making RKO's horror movies more profitable in general. And so one of the things that he stipulates is that the first thing he does is, in May of 1944, he signs Boris Karloff for a 2-picture deal with RKO to produce 2 movies with RKO as the star. Lewton is initially very disappointed with this because he's thinking, okay, this is another sign that they're going to try to get me to just make, gratuitous, light horror fantasy stories instead of the sort of intellectual stories that I want to be making. But what he finds is quite the opposite. He meets Boris Karloff, and he finds that Boris Karloff is a guy who himself is coming off of a period of deep despondency with the quality of scripts that he's being offered, with the quality of horror films in general. And so he's coming into this RKO deal himself with a lot of sympathy for Lewton and a lot of identification with Lewton's softer approach to horror films, which is this idea that Karloff brings to it, which is that he realizes that what he and Lewton both agree upon is that the real test of a good, scary picture isn't so much horror. It isn't so much the shock and visceral repulsion of throwing something gruesome into the audience face. It's the idea of terror, of teasing their suspense at something that is unpleasant and that they can fully imagine for themselves, that you leave to the spectator to make a bleaker image in their heads than you can paint for them explicitly. And at the other same time, Jack J. Gross is also coming in and he's saying, okay, you are also going to have a lighter development slate, so you will be able to concentrate more time on individual productions. You are also going to be getting longer production schedules, and you're going to be getting bigger budgets to produce your movies. So the irony is that, on the one hand, these final 3 films that Lewton is going to make for RKO, all of them are going to be of a type in the sense that they are distinguished from his previous horror films from 1943 through 1944, in that a lot of his horror films from that period were much more on the borderline between a kind of horror and a mystery or noir story. They were very contemporary in their focus. They were rarely very exotic or over the top in terms of their drama. So this new period, these 3 films starring Boris Karloff, they're all going to be period pictures. They're all going to take place in sort of things that we might identify with, like, the Universal style of horror movie. They take place in far-off, exotic locales, principally in Europe. But at the same time, this is going to represent a kind of last kind of flourishing of Lewton's creative spirit, because Lewton is not anything if he isn't a producer and a filmmaker who is able to deliver an above standard product with considerably low or below standard means. And so I think it comes down to is that these are, rather than there being on balance more limitations that are being placed on Lewton during this period, I think it's more accurate to describe his last 3 films for RKO as a period where he had different kinds of limitations that were ultimately more profitable for creative stimulation, for creating horror movies that are limited in a different way than his previous horror movies that they were limited, but nonetheless achieving a kind of artistic integrity to them. So the film we watched for today is the first of these films to be produced. It was not the first one to go into production. The first one to go into production was called Isle of the Dead. We'll be getting into Isle of the Dead on the next patron exclusive episode a week from now. And I will get into that episode on why Isle of the Dead went into production but suddenly stopped. What is most important for now is that after Isle of the Dead had to stop production, Lewton basically concentrated all of his energies on making this film, The Body Snatcher, starring Boris Karloff. The Body Snatcher is a movie that is adapted from a short horror story written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Robert Louis Stevenson also being probably best well known as the author of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the story is very morbid, and it's also interesting because despite the fact that it's a period story, I think what's interesting about it is that it's allowing Val Lewton to work with a subject that allows him to not do what other period horror movies seem to do, which is to set these movies in sort of remote, exotic period locations in order to create a kind of once upon a time fairy tale light fantasy feeling to it, and instead do the thing that Lewton would prefer to do, which is not unlike what he did with Mademoiselle Fifi, which is use these periods to create a kind of historical allegory about how changes in society are forced not necessarily by the better nature of people, but just because of the how circumstances compound upon themselves. You know, like The Body Snatcher, just as a general overview, it's a story about grave robbing, and it's a story that is referring to the days in Victorian England and the United Kingdom where grave robbing became quite common as medical sciences were starting to, and medical science academia was starting to really flourish and mature, and how there developed a kind of illicit economy in which individuals known as so-called resurrection men would dig up graves. Previously, resurrection men were identified as people who merely dug up graves so that they could sell the valuables and belongings they found in graves and tombs. What you see with the advance of medical science and the demand for access to cadavers that can be used in experimental and academic dissection for the teaching of doctors and of surgeons, is that you see the growth of an illicit economy of resurrection men who literally dig up freshly buried bodies and sell them to medical schools, basically without the consent of family members, at a time where basically it was not, obviously it's not legal to violate someone's grave, but on the side of the medical or the academic professional, it's not illegal for them to accept the body and to purchase a body off of someone, literally because there was not legal standing at that point to clarify whether or not you could be held accountable for accepting a body that was acquired through illegal means. And it's a very fascinating movie. It also happens to also be directed by Robert Wise, who previously directed, or rather saved the production of Curse of the Cat People, but then also directed Mademoiselle Fifi, and who would himself go on to be a very significant director in his own right. directing such films as The Day the Earth Stood Still, which we covered on the first season of the podcast. West Side Story, of course, he co-directed with Jerome Robbins. He would make The Haunting in 1963, The Sound of Music.
Another good music. Yeah, that's a good one, too.
And Star Trek The Motion Picture. And a lot of people rag on Star Trek The Motion Picture, but I actually really like Star Trek The Motion Picture. I think it's a fairly decent movie, but there's a lot of creative potential that's going into The Body Snatcher, and it would turn out to be the most profitable Lewton horror film since Cat People. So with all of that sort of preamble out of the way, just general thoughts. Like, you haven't seen The Body Snatcher in a long time, so what's it like revisiting the film?
I think it's seeing it again after many years. There's a lot of it I forgot. Mainly the interactions between McFarlane and John Gray, and the
McFarlane and John Gray being the kind of antagonists.
Sort
of, the
of,
story.
but
they're both kind. But there's no real protagonist.
No.
To the story?
No, there isn't.
I mean, it's just kind of a gruesome
It is.
circumstance.
Well, it's not a gruesome, it's just that it's an interesting story, and it strikes, having seen it, now I have to admit it does lose some of the flair, which is Val Lewton's use of symbolic photography to capture the essence of the dialogue and also whatever is happening. And also, but it's a clean movie. I think the sequences move quite well. It's edited very nicely. And also the music is very haunting music. As you know, in this movie, if you ever saw it, is that there's a street singer who gets killed.
Yeah, there's a blind beggar woman who is noted for her beauty and her singing voice, and she sings several classic traditional, I should say, not classic, traditional Scottish folk ballads. Throughout
in some places where she's killed, afterwards you still hear her, not voice, but the music of her voice.
Yeah, the score, the
score, very wonderful score.
The underscore seems to adopt the motif of her singing, as a as if her spirit is now haunting the movie, that with her death casts a entirely new horrific pall over the rest of the movie that cannot be recovered from, and is intuiting to you, well, there's going to be like some sort of, it's a very straightforward moral parable. Somebody needs to get their comeuppance for the death of the innocent.
As Meg Cameron, who gave, and I didn't quite get it. There were a couple places where it was very quick, and I didn't quite get the connection. She's the mistress of McFarlane, Wolf Toddy McFarlane, and yet she was at one time his wife, I guess, or something, and she used all of her money. So I don't know.
Well, no, she's not his wife. Now? She's his housekeeper, and his mistress. It is his wife, but he's married her in secret. He has not revealed to the public that he's married to her.
Right, and the idea is, I think that it has to do with your whether you have any kind of money when you go into marriage of high society. And so it's really interesting. There are a lot of little twists in it that are very symbolic of Edinburgh in that era.
Well, the setting in Edinburgh, Scotland.
Right.
I mean, there's this, and I mean...
The dowry. She didn't have a dowry. So if you don't have a dowry, then the marriage doesn't work because marriage can't be codified in that society. It's a very interesting movie.
Well, you can, but it just casts like a sort of like, again, there's
especially for a doctor, well-known doctor.
There's this coding of like classism throughout the story. And you see that also in I guess the closest thing you could say to a protagonist of the film, but who is really less a protagonist than he is just an overall observer of the story, which is the character Donald Fettes, played by Russell Wade.
Right. Again, we saw him on the Ghost Ship.
Yeah, on the Ghost Ship, playing and again, we're seeing him in a very similar story of a young person who comes from a lower class background, who rises up the ranks in society by pulling himself by his bootstraps, so to speak, but then is confronted with a superior who deeply identifies with him, possibly because they shared certain class struggles and a certain background.
Right.
But then who slowly loses their respect for that person and slowly begins to realize the extent of their moral corruption. Honestly, the Body Snatcher really is more of an elaborate take on the exact same story of the ghost ship.
But Wolf McFarlane isn't crazy like the ship captain. I mean, he's less crazy. Let's say that. He's driven by he's driven more. I'm trying to think of the film where, well, it's like any of the scientists, the crazy scientist movies that are driven by the.
Right. This is not a mad. Well, that's the thing. That's another thing. This is a movie. This is a horror movie about doctors, but it's not a mad doctor movie. It's not a mad science movie. This isn't a story about people who are mad.
Right.
It's really honestly. Exactly. They're cold and disaffected from the moral lines that they are crossing in order to do what they're doing.
Right.
And it's the same sort of thing where it's like, it's like what Wolf McFarlane, keeps impressing upon Donald Fetties in the movie is something that's not entirely different than something we've seen in a lot of Mad Doctor movies, and indeed in the Columbia Mad Doctor films, particularly Before I Hang, where it's this idea where the Mad Doctor in question is constantly impressing upon someone, sometimes in the pursuit of the greater good of scientific advancement, sacrifices need to be made. There's this libertarian streak to the sort of science as a kind of civic religion that supersedes all. But here you get a variation of that. But yeah, where once
it's still there though,
right? Exactly. Where weirdly enough, it is because it's not a science. There's no science fiction elements. Nothing supernatural happens. It is a very grounded period story, which makes it all the more interesting because it ends up being much more centered on a kind of conventional morality and a moral dichotomy and a moral parable than Lewton's previous films have been. Because Lewton's previous films have, by and large, been incredibly distant from questions of morality. You see it in something like Cat People or I Walked with a Zombie or The Leopard Man, and even in something like The Ghost Ship, you see a far greater interest in the idea of mental disorder, the idea that these characters who do these bad things are not necessarily doing them because they are morally corrupted. It's that they are pathologically disturbed. It is that they are driven to do things that are beyond their control. Whereas with The Body Snatcher, I think it is quite interesting that in adapting Robert Louis Stevenson's story, and I highly encourage everyone to read the Robert Louis Stevenson story because it's actually quite a good story. Very nice, very morbid, very gruesome in terms of what it's dealing with. I think it's an adaptation that is very true to the kind of Victorian fixation that would be appropriate to the time in which the story is placed. So we see the story not as a story of madness, but as a story of moral degeneracy. We perceive it the way that the characters in the story, bound to a certain period of time, how they would see it, not from a contemporary modern perspective, I think.
Right. It's almost as if it's fate that there's a history for Toddy McFarlane here, and it has to deal with John Gray, who's did some things with Dr. Robert Knox, who was
a real life Edinburgh physician,
right.
And I believe at the time that I think
1827 to 1828. I have my notes.
the Burke and Hare murders, which I'll go into more of that when we do the plot synopsis, because honestly, like the real life case of the Burke and Hare murders is totally intertwined with and bound up in the narrative of the Body Snatcher in the same way that it is in the short story, The Body Snatcher itself. You know, The Body Snatcher itself, the original story by Stevenson, is in some ways a satire of medical science. It is in some ways a kind of, it's consistent with a kind, and that's the other thing, is that, like, there's this extent to which The Body Snatcher as a film kind of appeals to something that was very common in the sort of Grand Guignol theater, the idea of these gruesome plays about madness and corruption and monstrosity and murder and rape, something that was very common in the Grand Guignol theater and the plays they put on. It more or less invented the trope of the mad doctor, and these plays became very expressive of the pervasive, deep distrust that people had of medical science and scientific institutions. This kind of collective phobia that, in order for you to have such a fixation on the body and on deconstructing the body and putting it back together, that there must be kind of something perverse or wrong
Black
with
magic,
you.
right?
Yeah. So,
Right.
and that's the thing. So the Body Snatcher becomes very old school in that way. It for a film made in 1945, it is more like one of the golden age Gothic horror movies of the 30s than it is. It's more like a film like Mad Love, I think, in a way, than it is necessarily like what Jack J. Gross would have probably preferred, which is like, you know, just a sort of like a blood and thunder universal monster rally starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, you know.
I mean, but and it isn't, but given its setting, what plays so well about it is that during that same time, I believe in the 40s. You talk about University of Pennsylvania, some of the very old schools that have been around since the 1800s. I mean, it was just 2 or 3 years ago that NPR did a actual interview of looking at the history of use of cadavers at University of Penn, and it wasn't quite so, you know, sanguine, nor was it, you know, kind of sketchy what was going on there in terms of collecting people off the streets and, you know, other dealings. And University of Pennsylvania had to defend itself in times of use of cadavers. And pretty soon it opened up a whole kind of challenge.
That's the thing, is that
people writing Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. Do you get people off the street or poor people that have no... And everybody had to explain to them, no, they're all bequeathed. Right now, we can't do that.
Because
we give your body to science.
You donate it to...
Right,
yeah.
you're right. It's all legal.
It's consented to by a loved one or something. But that's actually a good point to make, that, like, you know, a movie like The Body Snatcher is being made while it's referring to a period in a kind of critical period in terms of Victorian, in terms of the relationship between the academia of medical science and the general public, a very critical point in which new legislation was put in place in order to make more systematic and improve the legal management of the medical sciences and of medical
education in the movie, right?
And medical schools. Yes, yeah.
Like the fact let's do it now, because
although I will say that the movie actually takes place 1 year before the law it's referring to was passed.
Yeah. In fact, he met Dave. I mean, it's a really
but yes, you're right. In, you know, it's like at the time that this movie would have been made, you know, despite the fact that it depicts a period of time in which you do see this pivotal transition point in the relationship and the regulation of medical sciences, at least with regards to its relationship to the general public and what the rights of the general public are in terms of what medical professionals are allowed to do and what they're allowed to practice and how they're allowed to acquire materials and get licensing, etc., etc. At the same time, this movie coming out in the 40s, you know, the difference between Victorian England and 1940s America, I would wager to say it's not that much different in terms of the sort of general collective distrust of eggheads, for better or worse, of people who are elitists or
we're
people
singing now. What are you talking about?
Right, people who spend all their time, people who spend all their time with noses in books and therefore cannot be fundamentally trusted. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, there's something odd about them. You don't know what's odd about them, but you know that there must be something wrong with them if all they do is inject people with things and put things in centrifuges or whatever the fuck they're doing up in their dissection labs, you know. Do you want to go ahead and get into the synopsis, or did you have one more?
No, go ahead, get in the synopsis.
We take you now to lovely Edinburgh, Scotland. The year is 1831, and Russell Wade, having previously portrayed a naive young officer in Lewton's The Ghost Ship, now plays a naive young medical student named Donald Fettes, who is unhappy to report to his teacher, the renowned surgeon Dr. Wolfe McFarland, played by Henry Daniel, that he will be unable to continue his studies as his father can no longer keep up with the expenses. Seeing great potential in the young man, McFarlane offers to make Fettes his new assistant. Among Fettes' new duties includes the receipt and accounting for specimens delivered to the McFarlane school, which is to say, human specimens for the purposes of anatomical dissection and experimental surgery. McFarlane is frank with Fettes about the fact that his work will be quite gruesome indeed, though the law stipulates that medical schools can only receive and practice on unidentifiable bodies of paupers provided by the municipal council. Well, there simply aren't enough dead paupers to keep up with the rigorous demands of the rapidly advancing field of medical science. Hence, McFarlane has had to turn to paying for cadavers of the recently dead out of rifled graves. That's where Boris Karloff comes in, playing the looming and sepulchral John Gray. A coachman by day, Gray is a resurrection man by night, going out to the graveyard to purloin specimens for McFarlane's students. By chance meeting Gray at a public house, Fettes is deeply disturbed by the power he seems to exude over McFarlane. McFarlane clearly detests Gray and wants nothing to do with him, and Gray in turn relishes his disgust, sadistically toying with him and referring to him by the overly familiar, diminutive nickname Toddy. It's clear that the river runs deep between McFarlane and Gray, stretching back to when the former was himself a naive medical student, not unlike Fettes is now. A ruthless psychopath, it is on one of his expeditions that Gray summarily kills a dog guarding the grave of its owner. The event sparks extreme consternation in the community, making further attempts to acquire specimens all but impossible due to enhanced security and the local vigilance. This proves an ill-timed circumstance indeed. Fettes has been pressing McFarlane to accept the case of a young paraplegic girl named Georgina, Sharon Moffat, who, after suffering a severe accident, has developed a traumatic tumor that now presses on the nerves of her lower spinal column, inhibiting her ability to walk. McFarlane initially dismissed accepting the case because he was too busy teaching, but ironically, it was Gray toying with and mocking McFarlane who seemed to convince him to help the little girl. Ultimately, however, McFarlane is still reticent until he can practice performing the then novel surgery on a dead subject. Unbeknownst to McFarlane, Fettes goes to Gray's home and all but begs him to come up with a specimen, but is shocked and horrified when Gray delivers a body later that night. The body belongs to a blind beggar woman, recognized in the streets of Edinburgh for her physical beauty and her singing of traditional folk songs. Having seen the woman just that night before visiting Gray, Geddes realizes that Gray has turned to murder to make his trade. Fettes is desperate to go to the authorities, but McFarlane convinces him to stay quiet. McFarlane successfully performs the surgery on Georgina, and soon thereafter tells Gray his services will no longer be needed. But bodies don't go back in the grave so easily, it seems. Though there is no longer anything medically wrong with her, Georgina is still unable to walk. When McFarlane's dim-witted janitor, Joseph, played by Bela Lugosi, threatens to expose Gray to the authorities in exchange for money, Gray murders him and delivers the body to McFarlane's school, intent on coercing him into maintaining their professional relationship. Fettes insists on going to the authorities again, but McFarlane once again convinces him to stay silent while he attempts to deal with Gray. McFarlane's housekeeper and secret wife, Meg, played by Edith Atwater, reveals to Fettes the dark past of McFarlane and Gray. You see, our fictional Dr. Wolf McFarlane was once the medical student and assistant to the real-life Dr. Robert Knox, himself a famous anatomist and surgeon. In 1828, Knox became embroiled in a public scandal surrounding the so-called Burke and Hare murders. Williams Burke and Hare were a pair of criminals who killed 16 people and sold their bodies to Knox's medical school over the span of a single year. Much as occurs in the Body Snatcher, the initial receipt of these bodies would be handled by one of Knox's assistants, in this case, McFarlane. Knox was never implicated in the investigation, both because Burke's statement exonerated him of complicity and because there was as yet no law controlling the licensing of anatomy teachers or restricting how they purchased bodies. Nonetheless, Knox's professional reputation in the UK was destroyed by the incident, and popular accounts of the events continued to suggest that his and other anatomists had direct complicity in grave robbing and, in Knox's case, the Burke and Hare murders. In this fictionalized version of events, however, a certain gentleman of consequence, a student and assistant of Knox, was implicated in the murders, only for an anonymous porter to testify in his honor. The porter in question, who was then hounded by the mobs of Edinburgh, was Gray, whereas the gentleman of consequence, Meg reveals, was McFarlane. In a great struggle, McFarlane murders Gray and brings his body back to the school to be fully dissected by his students the next morning. Fettes, for his part, quits McFarlane's school and, while traveling around Edinburgh, meets Georgina and her mother on a bridge while they wait to see Gray's coach and white horse going by. While Fettes and her mother are distracted in conversation and Georgina hears the sound of hooves clopping on the path below, Georgina finds the courage to get herself out of her chair and to try to see over the bridge. Ecstatic at the proof that the surgery was indeed a success, Fettes seeks out McFarlane and learns from Meg that he's currently at an inn in an outlying town, having gone into the country to sell Gray's horse and coach. He finds McFarlane there and tells him the joyful news, which McFarlane treats as serendipitous given that he has finally got rid of Gray. When a group of mourners enters the inn, McFarlane is urged to go by the country graveyard and dig up a fresh specimen, and though he urges him not to do so, Fettes, out of foolish devotion to his teacher, follows him. They dig up the body of the newly deceased woman and load it in McFarlane's new buggy, driven by a black horse as opposed to Gray's white one. As a thunderstorm engulfs the country, McFarlane and Fettes race back to Edinburgh as quickly as possible, the wrapped-up body jostling in the back of the carriage. When it lurches forward into McFarlane, he is surprised by the weight of it, and amid the tumult of the storm believes he hears Gray's voice calling out to him. He stops the buggy, convinced that the body has gotten heavier. Fettes steps out and aims the gaslight as McFarlane unwraps the body, finding Gray's body underneath the wrapping. In horror, McFarlane whips the horses and gallops off into the night, only for it to break loose of the buggy, sending him careening over a cliff. When Fettes arrives at the scene, he finds McFarlane dead, and in the shawl, only the same woman who they dug up from the grave. Alone, he walks back to Edinburgh.
Some of the, I think for the listeners, that some of the most interesting dialogue, and you may remember things like Cape Fear between the two characters, where it wasn't good enough to be bought off. What he wanted to do is get revenge, and here we see the same thing. But although it's a long-term revenge, Gray, right. Toddy tries to buy off Gray. Says, "I'll even make you rich. You won't even have," and John Gray says, "I don't care about being rich. I like the idea that you're under my control."
Right.
And it's a really remarkable, but there's something about it that touches all of us. The friends that, you grow up with and you say, I just can't, you're not friends anymore. You just have to start to separate. So a lot of those things, when you get older, there are certain chords that it tugs on that you experience in real life. I thought it was a very interesting scene. Like when I was younger, all we cared about were the killings. When you watch a movie, you don't
right.
really, and
there's only one.
Right.
It's
that's
just
right.
like,
right.
Like
the
rest of it is just
the killing scene of the
the
singer,
beggar woman,
is just a remarkable scene because, and I think that is the handiwork of the director and also, of course, of our person that we're honoring, right?
Producer.
Producer.
Yeah.
that it just disappears into the foggy darkness, and in the middle of her high pitch, you hear her snuffed out.
Yeah, you see her disappear down a
Yeah,
dark
it's really
tunnel.
an amazing scene.
Gray goes with his carriage after her, and then we just hold on the dark, wide shot of the alleyway,
Right,
and
yeah.
then she reaches that high note, and then it's just abruptly cut short,
Right.
and that's all it is. Yeah.
So it's just there are a lot of great scenes in it. It doesn't have all the atmosphere or symbolism, like I mentioned before, that was done by who are we doing?
Well, I don't think, and that's the thing. I think I think
There are some scenes where it does, but that one scene is a hallmark.
I mean, it's one of those things where you're watching this movie and you don't realize until the climax of it. I mean, like, there's this kind of it's not really it's not a mystery movie, but there is a kind of suspense at slowly learning how McFarlane got into this situation
Yes.
where he is stuck in this parasitic relationship with this absolutely abominable character. And honestly, like, obviously, Karloff gives one of the best
It
performances
is
of his
absolutely
career.
amazing. He's so sinister, and yet.
And you agree with him. You sympathize with him at points because you realize, because it's the same thing where it's like it's very much related to the kind of class relationship that is throughout the movie where, McFarlane takes a shine to Fetty's, but he can physically heal this poor girl who has been crippled by an accident. He can physically repair her, but he can't motivate her or convince her to rise from her wheelchair.
Right, but the important issue is that, like you said, but there's something important about the elements of where evil versus evil. Another underlying thing, evil versus evil brings out good. So when the Russell Wade character, Fetty's, tries to convince Toddy McFarlane to do the surgery, he still refuses because he's too busy. And then they meet Gray, and Gray uses his influence.
Gray is the one who
You're
wants
going
him
to do the
it.
surgery. And,
Which you see a bit of humanity that is
not humanity. I think it was just his control again. By accident, Toddy McFarlane says, "Okay, yeah, I guess it would be good for my stature if I do that surgery." He tries to make it sound like he's not that Gray is not in control of him, but that he made a decision of himself that yes, I guess I'll have good standing. And
that's the thing. Then
he does the surgery. The girl can't walk, and who does he try to go for solace? It's Boris Karloff, and Boris Karloff shows him his inner spirit.
Well, he literally turns his face to a mirror and says, like, do you think the things that with those eyes, the things that they've seen, do you think that you have the capacity to heal
but
people?
he dissects them one by one.
It's almost as if, like, Gray, like, knew preternaturally that the surgery was not going to be successful. That he knew that, like, the reason that McFarlane was afraid to perform the surgery was not just he was afraid of it going wrong. And again, you see the reoccurrence of themes from Ghost Ship. In Ghost Ship, there's an entire scene where, a critical moment where the younger character played by Russell Wade is almost completely disillusioned with his superior when the superior character has to perform some life-saving surgery and proves unable to do it. There's the same dynamic where it's like this. Yeah,
it's not a dynamic, but
this idea that McFarlane, after all these years, is only comfortable working on stolen dead bodies. I mean, he's afraid to heal people.
But I wanted to illustrate to the people that are listening to this that whole interchange between. It's a very remarkable scene because Gray knows this guy inside out, and even when he takes, like he says, "Look, Gray," he takes Gray's glass and overturns the other glass on top and says, "This is what a spinal vertebrae
acts like." Yeah.
When you put it together, it works. And what does Gray do? He just summarily slaps the whole system down onto the ground and crashes. It's an amazing scene.
And this is the thing. Like, this is one those again.
He's not only sinister; he's smart.
Well, he's not just. But that's the thing. Is like he's not just smart. He's like offended. Like it's like that's what I mean. Is that there is this weird thing about the movie in which. Both in the way that Gray, when he meets Georgina, he immediately endears himself to her.
Right.
Because for whatever, it's sort of the same way that little girls always relate to, or little kids always relate to the Frankenstein monster. They see the monster and they immediately relate to something that is pure or childlike in them.
Right,
and
or
Gray,
the innocence of it.
Right,
And
and
Gray recognizes
Gray
the
is like,
innocence.
Gray is like a kind of schoolyard bully in a
Right,
way. He's the kid who is just out to make, but like when he's faced with the fact that McFarlane, and that's the thing,
He's
McFarlane,
taking him down a peg.
He's taking him down a peg, but the reason he slaps those things away is because he's legitimately offended. Like, it's not just that he wants to torture McFarlane for no reason. He legitimately hates McFarlane at like a deep sort of level that has more to do with the fact that you think that all of these pretenses of your accreditation and your class and your standing, you think that those things are supposed to add up to your ability to heal a person. And then I can just point your face in the mirror and I can say, you and I are exactly the same.
And then he gets up and says, we're not alike. And he gets up and leaves.
And that's the thing about the movie is that like there's this extent to
this
extent to which is that like so much of the movie is about the kind of the Janus faces of Gray and McFarlane, how they're both sides of the same psyche. And Fettes is the guy caught in the middle. Right. Fettes is the guy who comes from a lower class and is attempting to raise his station in life. Gray is someone who is stuck in the lower classes, and McFarlane is someone who is in the higher station of life. But
he sacrificed himself. Gray sacrificed himself, as you mentioned. He was a porter, right?
Right, exactly. He did what he had to do in order to save a gentleman of standing.
Right.
And he took the blows. He was the one who was pilloried and had his reputation ruined. Yeah.
Right. So he ends up being a mere cabman.
Yeah, exactly. You see the layering of kind of class themes that are persistent in a lot of Lewton's films. How fundamentally there is this, and in as much as we want to say, Gray is clearly parasitic and coercing McFarlane, we slowly learn over the course of the movie that this is McFarlane's personal hell. This is his poetic punishment for exploiting someone in a weaker social and economic position in order to get away with his own wrongdoing.
But there are other nice little scenes in it. The whole class system is really illustrated by the medical students. The medical students, although they don't get big part there, you could tell they're upper society people, like Service.
They're not like Fettes.
Right. Yeah. They're not like Fettes, exactly. So you get that kind of thing. And it's very interesting. Like you said, that Toddy McFarlane then goes ahead and takes Fettes because Fettes is of his class beginnings coming up. It's just a remarkable kind of, and it's all done quite well. And so although many of the other films have more atmosphere and more of because they were less diverse in terms of characters and different storylines, but this fits together pretty doggone well. And when this film goes along and stuff like that.
Well, the only place where it kind of strains credulity is with the character of Fettes himself, and it is with the sheer number of times that he keeps going along with McFarlane.
Well, that's right. So Jakoby does the same thing. Yes, I guess you're right. The captain does, since the captain is responsible for the lives of his shipmates, then he can kill his shipmates. And you understand so and so. Yes,
well, here it's about. I mean, here at least, like you have this whole thing where it's like, and again, we've seen this again in The Man with Nine Lives, where the relationship between this older doctor and this younger doctor, and the sympathizing of the younger doctor because of their naivety with the idea that, like you say, with the ghost ship, that there is something, that there are inherent rights that come with being in a position of power because you assume responsibility for so many people. Your infinite obligations, in a way, give you kind of infinite rights within this echelon of society. And so much of the movie really is about Fettes sort of being strung along really quite stupidly, really quite foolishly. And Meg says it right to his face that, like, you're just a fool, like endemically. Like you keep
get up and go.
You
Right.
keep
Get
thinking
out.
that there's
Right.
a purpose to defending McFarlane. He's just getting what's coming to him and what he should have had coming to him earlier.
Right.
But you think that there's still something worth defending in terms of his dignity. And so by the end of the film, it is interesting that, like, and again, so he comes from an outer lying, smaller, rural town. He comes to the big city in order to advance his station in life. So again, there is this constant theme and this layering of the theme in the movie about Fetty's straddling the line between two different worlds, and the extent to which Gray, in a weird way, represents like prejudices he has internalized about lower class people and about their lack of intellect and their lack of moral compass and their lack of clear vision for what is best for society. But the whole film is about this sort of dark realization that he has, that McFarlane is the architect of his own doom, and that he and Gray are in a weird way bound together like two halves of a psyche. Even when Gray is completely destroyed, he remains with McFarlane, like at a deep pathological level. And then so how does the movie end? He's right back on the long, dark road from where he started to where he's supposed to be going. So it's one of those things where he's forever on this path that doesn't really have a ending.
There's no off ramp for it.
Right. And I think that's one of the darker things about the movie is that, like, you know, despite the fact that, you know, and I guess it makes sense because Fetty's is our window into the story of the movie, but the movie itself is not terribly invested in Fetty's. Fetty's seems to be another in a long line of these Lewton protagonists. The former played by Russell Wade in The Ghost Ship, but also characters that Kent Smith has portrayed, particularly in Cat People and Curse of the Cat People, which are these characters who in any other American film would be such a focal point of interest, which is to say that they're enough of a blank slate, enough of a kind of vague everyman that you can just project an identification onto them. It seems that with Lewton's movies, he very much does cast exactly these sorts of blank, unaffected, everyman characters, but then consistently portrays them as oafs who are ultimately so much less sympathetic than the monstrous characters of the story. Like, you know, so Kent Smith in Cat People will be this guy who's like, you know what, like, I guess I just got into a relationship with this woman and I've never been unhappy before in my life, and I guess I got into something that I wasn't prepared to deal with because I'm not mature enough to deal with it. And then, you know, with Cat People, it becomes a story about a man who effectively, like, ruins a woman's life by giving her hope that isn't there. And then in something like The Ghost Ship and something like The Body Snatcher, a character like Fetty's really, far more so than the superficial monster in Gray, really projects like a deeply pessimistic attitude about human nature and the nature of the average person. Because really all that Fetty's is guilty of is being naive. And it seems that in the world of Val Lewton, it seems that being naive is the most damnable thing. That being that naive person is that, you know, at least McFarlane and Gray get the finality of dying together in this kind of romantic struggle between them. Whereas Fetty's is just stuck with and is just left with the incredible trauma of being through this, and with no direction in life.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of something similar to this. This kind of, I really don't like it for films like this. Some of the sins, of course, the sins of the Toddy McFarlane. I mean, sins in general, not in terms of the religious aspect, but the Toddy McFarlane, because of what he was participation in these kinds of grave robbing with the Birkenhair murders.
Right. And that's the thing. With the Birkenhair murders, once that becomes implicated, it then becomes implicated that McFarlane was aware that Birkenhair were murdering people.
Right.
So, like, that's just...
And that's where Fetties finds himself, right?
Right.
He's almost certain that... And probably Knox did the same thing with Todd. Maybe Toddy at one point did raise it, or he didn't.
Although, again, the timeline of this is very weird, because the movie takes place in 1831, and those murders took place in 1828. The timeline is very weird with this movie.
Yeah, how old can it been?
It's almost... And again, like, this is part of the Jack J. Gross's universal ethos affecting Val Lewton's filmmaking, because we talked about how the timeline of the Frankenstein movies is completely insane.
Right.
Here, it almost seems like the Birkenhair murders in this movie were like deliberately set, like 20 years earlier than they actually happened. Yeah.
Just to let the audience know, though, I mean, I haven't read the Birkenhair murders, but I remember the hair wasn't really much of a. He would hold the people, and Burke. He had arachnodactyly. He had this disease where he had very long, thin fingers. And so, not like you see in the movie where he just snuffs someone. What he used to do is take his index finger and middle finger, I remember just reading this, and he would run it up their nose and block it, and then with the rest of his hand go over the mouth
that's awful.
While hair hold the person down. That's how they worked in a team. I just wanted to point that out to readers. If you look it up, you'll see that's... I can't remember where I read that, but I thought it was an interesting thing. But
it is, like, for a film that's made about the period it's about, it is a horror movie, I think, rather definitively, despite the fact that there's no supernatural element, there's no marquee monster, although I guess Boris Karloff just putting his face on a movie poster kind of satisfies the obligatory
like Targets.
Marquee monster. Yeah, exactly. At this point in his career, Boris Karloff, I think he's riding very high on the confidence created by Arsenic and Old Lace. Like, he did this amazingly successful run of this really successful play. And I think he's in a position where he's hoping that better roles are going to come in the future. It's not going to work out very much for Karloff any more than it is for Lewton, because the 40s can't last forever. But yeah, I mean, at least as far as it's going to be fascinating seeing, Boris Karloff really showing his sort of dimensions as an actor that he hadn't really gotten to show in the last decade, the first half of the 40s. Yeah, and as far as Robert Wise, Lewton wanted to work with Robert Wise again after this, but unfortunately the situation with Robert Wise turned out to be a lot like the situation with Jacques Tourneur, where, the moment the Body Snatcher does really well, rather than keeping Robert Wise and Lewton paired, what RKO does it splits them off, because what Lewton had originally wanted to do was he wanted to develop an adaptation of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which is this late 19th century vampire story. He wanted to develop that with Wise, but eventually, but Wise would be taken away. He would go on to direct A Game of Death, which is a remake of The Most Dangerous Game. It's interesting to imagine what could have happened if they had kept them together, if, like, we had gotten to see more Wise, Lewton, and Karloff movies, but unfortunately, it simply wasn't meant to be. I think that's going to do it for now. When we come back with our patron exclusive episode, we're going to be discussing the movie that went into production before The Body Snatcher, but then kind of went right back into production after The Body Snatcher completed photography and had its own kind of troubled production timeline, because unfortunately this is a case where Lewton, basically once he became invested in The Body Snatcher, he kind of lost passion in the film that he had started before it. But when we come back, we'll break it down. For the next episode, it's going to be Isle of the Dead. That's going to be an exclusive for patrons. I'd like to thank all of our patrons for supporting the podcast. Their support helps us to do this and keeps the program ad-free. If you are not a patron, you can get access to all of our patron exclusive and bonus content, just $1 a month. That's all it takes. Otherwise, that's going to do it for us here. We will see you next week with Isle of the Dead on Monster Craze Memoirs.